best worldview warfare. In the previous episode, we explored the ancient endeavor to fulfill the great work, which is the ultimate end goal of all revolutionary worldview warfare. In this episode, we will begin going into greater detail about revolutionary worldview warfare. First up is the Zeitgeist. Let's begin with the word itself. Zeitgeist is a German compound word. The first part, Zeit, refers to space-time. On one hand, this can mean world history in general. An example would be the march of empires from antiquity to today. On the other hand, this can mean a particular location in time. An example would be August 2021 in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am currently recording this episode. Now on to the second part of the word, Geist. Geist refers to spirit. What do I mean by spirit? Put simply, I mean inspiration. So I'm going to introduce two terms here, collective unconscious and collective conscious. The collective conscious comprises the shared avenues of human inspiration shaping and reflecting a collective's conduct and lifestyles. Some of these avenues include opinions, feelings, and gestures. Such inspiration is perceived by the mind. For an example of collective conscious, think about hip-hop celebrities' influence on young people today as discussed in the previous episode. The collective unconscious comprises the shared avenues of spiritual inspiration shaping and reflecting a collective's understanding and interpretation of reality. Some of the avenues include dreams, visions, and promptings. Such inspiration is perceived by the spiritual heart, which I will refer to in this episode as heart. For an example of collective unconscious, think about the Ascended Master's influence on New Agers as discussed in the previous episode. So putting the two parts together, Zeitgeist basically refers to the natural and supernatural inspirations shaping and reflecting the hearts and minds of the masses in a given space and time. Now that we have defined Zeitgeist, we can discuss its mode of operating. In a nutshell, the Zeitgeist provides the meta-narrative that contextualizes a given worldview storyline and enhances the meaning of messaging within that storyline. There are two aspects of narrative that will help you understand what I'm talking about. On one hand, narrative delivers the strategy and grounds all communication. Strategy is the most efficient path to achieving an objective. Grounding is the common ground, the mutual knowledge and customs fundamental for effective communication. On the other hand, narrative is persuasive and infused with things that motivate. Persuasion is the process of getting someone to accept something. Motivation is an intellectual, emotional, or moral justification which compels acceptance. So putting those two aspects of narrative together, we can start to see how Zeitgeist operates. Suppose we have a group called Legion who devised a teaching called XYZ. Also suppose we have a targeted collective called Peoples who currently live on a large Pacific island. Now that we have the players and setting defined, let's begin the scenario. Legion intends for XYZ to foster deceptive worldviews which will enable them to rule over peoples. This is the strategy. Legion designed XYZ to resonate with people's existing culture. This is the common ground. Legion takes a cue from Genesis chapter 3 verse 6 and promotes XYZ in such a way as to appeal to people's own desires for either 1. Securing food, water, shelter, 2. experiencing pleasure, or 3, living an advantaged life. This is the persuasion and motivation. Now, you may be wondering at this point why I didn't mention details like what exactly is the XYZ teaching? Where does the truth end and lies begin in XYZ? And how is XYZ promoted? Those details fall under the purview of technique, propaganda, and wicked deception, each of which will be discussed in later episodes. So back to the Zeitgeist discussion. As peoples increasingly embrace XYZ and popularize it amongst themselves, XYZ becomes part of people's collective conscience. And as each day passes, peoples unknowingly yet willingly weaken their own mental and spiritual defenses. But how can we tell if people's defenses are weakening? I mean, we can't read people's minds or know what is going on in people's hearts. Indeed, the zeitgeist must be analyzed indirectly. There are 2 ways to do this indirect analysis. Both involve focusing on ideological terms that reflect the zeitgeist. Ideological terms are terms which express the concepts based on or relating to some system of ideas. First thing to focus on is the spread of ideological terms. Here we want to identify how and why people uses those terms. Second thing to focus on is the impact of ideological terms. Here we want to identify people's social norms created or changed via those terms. So I'm going to present 2 real-life analyses of the zeitgeist to bring together all the points I've discussed so far. In both analyses, you will see how rulers took pre-existing terms and infused them with ideological significance. The first analysis covers 17th through 18th century North America and focuses on the ideological term white.
Okay, here's what Allen writes on the back cover of Volume 1 of the Invention of the White Race. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor, according to the colonial records, would there be for another 60 years. The word white does not appear in a Virginia colonial record until 1691. But it's not simply that the word white doesn't appear. The white race as we know it was not functioning. And he bases this on going through 885 county years of Virginia colonial records. He was camped out in Richmond going through all these primary sources. And I now have his papers, which we're looking to place at a major repository, but he's got over 1,000 pages of transcribed notes from this early period. No one else has done this. And what he's always doing is he's looking at wherever in the records laboring people had a voice. To elaborate on that, others living in the colony at the time were English. They had been English when they left England, and naturally they and their Virginia-born children were English. They were not white. White identity had to be carefully taught over the next 60 years. Didn't come naturally, right? Had to be taught. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, 1677. This is a big event. I'm going to get into this in more depth. But in Bacon's Rebellion, in that insurrection, the poor and working people, European and African American, fighting together, demanding their freedom from bondage. They kick out the governor. They burn Jamestown. And in the final stages, a ship captain was one of the people sent to put them down, and he writes, "I there met 400 English and Negroes in arms," still not white, right, "who were much dissatisfied. Some were for shooting me, and others were for cutting me in pieces. I told them that they all were pardoned and freed from their slavery. Most of them I persuaded to go, except in the end, 80 Negroes and 20 English would not deliver their arms." Still not white. So here's the main theses of Allen's work. The white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity as manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion. It's the Civil War stage, the second stage of Bacon's Rebellion, when people start coming together, right? The way it was done, a system of racial privileges was deliberately instituted by the late 17th, early 18th century Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race and to establish a system of racial oppression. And Allen goes on to argue the consequence was not only ruinous for African Americans, it was, but was also disastrous for European American workers, right? And their position, he elaborates, their position in relation to the rich and powerful was not improved, but it was weakened by the white skin privilege system.
The second analysis covers 18th century Western Europe and focuses on the ideological term Caucasian.
In the late 18th century, Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, an 18th century German scholar, assigned the name to people living in Western Europe, to the River Ob in Russia, to Northern Africa, and to India, call them Caucasian. It's a large group of people. Blumenbach enjoyed a scholarly reputation that gave his designation enormous heft, and it got picked up very quickly. Although the term Caucasian now has many synonyms, including white, it retains a certain currency by dint of repetition. Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of physical anthropology, the father of scientific anthropology, called the people in Europe, over to India, well into Russia and North Africa, Caucasians, because they were the most beautiful in the world. And here you have Blumenbach and the skull that inspired the designation. And Blumenbach says, also for the determination of the really most beautiful form of skull, which in my beautiful typical head of a young Georgian female, always of itself attracts every eye, however little observant. Blumenbach had 82 skulls, and this made him an expert in human taxonomy. He made a five-fold designation, a taxonomy of human types. He called them varieties, and he arranged them from left to right. So he arranged the skulls according to difference. So at the two ends were the Mongolian and the African, and he thought of them as the extremes. In the middle is the beautiful one. It's the gorgeous median, and that's the Caucasian. And then the ones beside the Caucasian are the American and the Malay, because he thought those were the intermediate races. So in short, Blumenbach's most beautiful skull, the one in the middle, gave this large group of people, which we can call white people, but it includes many others, the name Caucasian. Now, a fuller answer. We need to look at Russian imperialism and English imperialism, scholarly networks, and slavery. Slavery, which gave rise to the figure of the odalisque, that is the beautiful white slave girl, as a figure of quintessential beauty. So this is about beauty not only of skulls, but also of slave girls.
In conclusion, there are three key takeaway points from this episode. Number one, the Zeitgeist refers to the natural and supernatural inspirations shaping and reflecting the hearts and minds of the masses in a given space and time. Number two, the Zeitgeist is like a meta-narrative that contextualizes a given worldview storyline and enhances the meaning of messaging within that storyline. Number three, the Zeitgeist can be measured by analyzing the spread and impact of ideological terms. These discussions are a companion to my book entitled Revolution: An Introduction to the Art and Science of Worldview Warfare. It cites hundreds of scientific articles and elite books on the Zeitgeist. Thanks for your time. Stay tuned. Next, we will explore technique in greater detail.